Talking about living in multicultural worlds. There we go. Acculturation is the process by which people migrate to and learn a culture that is different from their original or heritage culture, like the sunglasses on this uh, indigenous person from the Amazon. Moving to a new culture involves psychological adjustment. This adjustment occurs over a wide variety of domains, acquiring a new language, learning new interpersonal and social behaviors, becoming accustomed to new values, becoming a member of a minority group, adjusting one's self concept. Let me give you a quick example. When I first arrived on the Navajo Nation, I was driving down the road between Gallup and Salie, and I saw a line of cars that were stopped. I couldn't figure out what had happened. I didn't know what was going on. And so I kind of creeped past everybody trying to figure out what was going on. And then I just kind of took off down the road. And as soon as I passed everybody, that everybody else pulled out. I was told later that a coyote had run across the road. Nobody wanted to be the first one to drive down the road after the drive on the road that the coyote had crossed. So that was me, and it's supposed to be bad luck. I'm not sure what bad luck happened, but I'm sure something did. Anyway, that's a good example. Couldn't figure out what was going on. It happened to me two or three other times when I was driving between Gallup and Salie. So there you go. Leisgard, in 1955, tracked a number of Norwegian Fulbright scholars in the United States. In the first few months of their experiences, the migrants were having an especially positive time in their visit. They were enjoying the experiences, meeting new people, trying new food, communicating with people in a foreign language, and feeling the excitement of participating in a novel and exotic environment. Oberg in 1960 referred to the first few months as the honeymoon stage. It is the existence of the honeymoon stage that keeps the tourism trade in business. Most travelers do not stay in a new culture long enough to move past this stage, and they thus tend to view their experiences in new cultures to be, for the most part, pleasant and exciting. Following the honeymoon stage, most visitors turn a corner and begin to have increasingly negative views about their host culture. Between 6 and 18 months, visitors experience the most negative feelings of their sojourn in a stage that has been labeled the crisis or culture shock stage. And as somebody that has been in the military and someone who has been overseas a couple of different times, I can tell you that this is very much true. After about the sixth month, you start getting tired of the fact that what you don't have, and the strange things that you have to acknowledge. In the culture shock stage, the thrill of having novel and exotic experiences wears off, and these experiences become tiring and difficult. At this stage, recent migrants often realize their language skills are not yet good enough for them to fully function in the new environment. Now, I was lucky when we were in Germany because I was playing softball, and because I was playing softball, um, I was able to maintain a fairly strong excitement about being overseas. During the culture shock stage, the migrant realizes that they do not have a rich enough understanding of how the system works to thrive. The people they initially met who were interested in them because they were exotic and different are no longer so interested in their differences. Recent migrants may also be discovering that the television programs just aren't as interesting as the ones they used to see in their home country, and they start to miss their favorite foods. This is the time that homesickness can become very strong. And of course, you see this in the military all the time, people becoming homesick. Culture shock is the feeling of being anxious, helpless, irritable, and in general homesick that one experiences after moving to a new culture. The symptoms of culture shock includes missing your close friends and family, missing the little things about being back home, like conversations with bus drivers, eating your favorite snack that doesn't exist wherever you are. One of the things that I remember about being in Germany, we were getting food and things from the United States because we were an Air Force base, and so we were getting some food from the United States. But one thing that they didn't have in Germany was Mountain Dew. And I can remember the first time Mountain Dew, somebody flew a pallet of Mountain Dew in from the States. It was gone in like 20 seconds. Everybody just snatched it right up. And so after that, they started bringing Mountain Dew in on a regular basis. There were people that were selling Mountain Dew for 2, 3 times as much for just a can of Mountain Dew. It was just so weird. Anyway, okay. A sojourner in culture shock may wallow in the crisis stage for several months and then start to adjust and begin to enjoy their experiences more. Their language abilities improve, enabling them to function better in their daily lives. Eventually, sojourners become better able to make enduring friendships with the locals, and they adapt to things in the new culture, such as the TV programming and the food, so that these no longer felt strange. They had started thinking more and more like the locals around them. This stage, labeled the adjustment phase, tends to extend over a number of years. People become more and more proficient at the functioning in their new culture. There you go. Just join the hunt, buddy. Tattoo yourself up. Or paint yourself, I guess. He's probably painted. Oh, there you go. Which one is the person that doesn't belong? Could it be her? She has hair just like this lady. But these ladies don't have their breasts covered, and she does, of course. Oh, she's got exactly the same. This thing is exactly the same. But she's painted her arms brown, I guess. Red? Looks more red than brown, anyway. Okay. This is kind of a weird one. This lady is shirtless, just like the women in here, but she isn't being looked at quite the same. This is that's a pillow. That's a headrest. People sleep on those. I don't know if I would have taken my shirt off if I were you, lady. Wait a minute. Who's got his arm? Oh, that's her arm. Okay. He doesn't look very happy. Yeah. Okay. Those are AK-47s. Those guys are raising up. Anyway, I'm not sure I would have done that. Sojourners may go through the same adjustment stages when they return home. Initially, people are elated to see their families and friends again and to be able to eat their favorite foods. It is not uncommon for people to soon experience reverse culture shock and find themselves puzzling over why they did not quite feel at home anymore and why they feel somewhat alienated from those around them. They don't feel like they are a good fit anymore. And the reason is because they have changed their culture. Their culture has adjusted. And now going back home doesn't feel the same. And I can tell you that's actually the way it works. If you leave home and then try to come back, you see all the things that you don't like about your home. It's really weird. Same thing happened to me in Indiana. Um, I went to college in Indiana, and then I joined the military right out of college. And when I would go back and visit my parents, things were just a little bit off. I was being trained in Texas. Took basic training in Texas, then I took my initial training in Texas. Then I went to Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, and it still felt funny. I mean, Indiana just didn't feel quite right. And then where did I go next? Texas again. I went back to Texas. Japan is a country that is relatively ethnically homogenous. 98% of the people living in Japan are Japanese. So all of these people that you see are Japanese, except this guy right here. Well, maybe he is Japanese. Anyway, They're ethnically Japanese. Regardless of how well people learn the customs or master the language, they will always stand out as different from the other 98% who are ethnically Japanese. And these people are called gaijin. Gaijin means that you're not Japanese. It actually is a strange word that has lots of meanings, but one of the meanings is the person that sneaks in the window at night, as weird as that sounds. Cao Ying in 1995 tracked the acculturation experiences of a few hundred migrants to Japan, but didn't find the pattern that Lisgard had seen in 1955. Instead of a U-shaped curve where things start out great, get worse, then recover, the researchers discovered a rather pessimistic L-shaped curve where things stay bad. Xiao Ying discovered that people who had been in Japan for 5 years were just as negative toward Japan as those who had been there for just over a year. They all seemed in the depths of the crisis stage. The author speculates that the adjustment phase starts somewhere after 5, but before the 10-year point. And there you go. That's a reality of Japan. And one of the reasons is because it is so ethnically Japanese. And when they look at you, and when everybody looks at you, they see somebody as different. You don't feel like you're part of the country. And that's why, and you can go on YouTube and type in there people who live in Japan, or Americans who live in Japan, and you're going to get the same story over and over and over again. The only people that seem to adjust a little bit better are people that marry somebody who's Japanese. Cultural distance is the difference between cultures and their overall ways of life. We can hypothesize that the more cultural distance someone needs to travel, the more difficulty that person will have acculturating. As you can see, this guy, everybody around him is carrying something, a stick. This guy's got a sword, but they've all got their turbans on, and of course he doesn't have anything. So his cultural distance is much greater. There are various measures that can be used to determine acculturation across cultures. One indirect measure is language performance. Several studies show that the best predictors of acculturative success is language ability. So the better you know the language, the more likely that you will be able to adjust readily. Knowles and colleagues speculated that the greater the confidence in the mastery of the host country's language, the greater the identity with the culture. Many researchers have found a connection between language skills and success acculturating. When foreign students seek entry into the United States universities, they are required to take the TOEFL, the test of English as a foreign language. Researchers show that individuals who came from countries that are similar to English, such as Dutch and German, perform better than those who grew up speaking other European languages that are a little more distant, the Romance languages, such as French and Spanish. So the people that have the easiest time acculturating to the United States are the Dutch and the Germans. According to the Educational Testing Service, which administers the TOEFL, speakers of Indo-European languages tend to perform better on the TOEFL than those who speak languages from highly distant language groups, such as the Kazakhs and the Japanese, and these people are Kazakhs. Cultural distance encapsulates more than just language. Many other skills must be mastered when people move to a new culture. Ward and Kennedy in 1995 compared the adjustment of Malaysian university students in New Zealand, a culture that is quite different from their own, despite that the not so distant proximity between Malaysia and New Zealand, and a group of Malaysian students in Singapore, a similar culture. The students completed a measure of cultural adjustment that assessed their daily problems in navigating through the new culture. After spending almost 3 years in the two countries, the Malaysian students who were studying in Singapore reported having fewer difficulties than those who were studying in New Zealand. Sojourners from more distant cultures suffer from more distress, require more medical consultations, and have more social difficulties in general than those who traverse less cultural distances. Some indigenous Canadian tribes, such as the Tsimshian of the Northwest Pacific Coast region, engaged in subsistence practices, primarily fishing for salmon and shellfish, that allowed them to accumulate large quantities of food and establish permanent, highly stratified settlements long before they had any contact with the Europeans. The Tsimshian, they were in the northwestern portion of Canada. The Eastern Cree live just below the tree line in northern Quebec. They engage in subsistence practices, hunting in the winter and fishing in the summer, which does not allow them to accumulate much food, so some of the bands are migratory and have low sociocultural stratification. The Carrier, it's Tlashmin or Athapascan speaking group, live on the Rocky Mountain Plateau of northern British Columbia, also engage in hunting and fishing like the Eastern Cree. But because they have the possibility of accumulating large numbers of salmon at the headwaters of some rivers, and because their culture was influenced geographically close to the Tsimshian, the Carrier represent a culture with a moderate degree of food accumulation and social stratification. Barry and Annis in 1974 speculated that the more stratified the culture, the more similar they were to a European culture, the easier it would be to acculturate to European dominance. The Tsimshian acculturated the easiest, the Eastern Cree had the most stress in acculturating, and the Carrier were somewhere in between. And these are Canadian Indigenous people. They call them First Nation people up in Canada. And this is a Canadian First Nation person as well. Cultural fit is the degree to which an individual's personality is more similar to the dominant cultural values in the host culture. It would seem that the greater the cultural fit of a person with the host culture, the more easily he or she should acculturate to it. People who score high on extroversion are more likely to move to other countries, particularly to urban areas, when compared with those who are less extroverted. Some researchers have proposed that because extroversion should facilitate communication everywhere, extroverts should always fare better in the acculturation experience compared with introverts. The study in New Zealand found that Malaysians high on the extroversion scale showed more signs of well-being than those who scored low. However, English-speaking expatriates in Singapore who scored high on the extroversion scale reported more depression, boredom, frustration, and health problems. Extroversion does not always facilitate acculturation. It appears that an extroverted personality makes a better cultural fit in New Zealand than it does in Singapore. And extroverts will fare better in the acculturation experience only when they fit in well with the culture. So if the culture is a more extroverted culture, like in the United States, like in the Western world, then the extrovert will acculturate faster, and the introvert will not. But in a more introverted culture like Singapore or in Asia or in Japan, a more introverted individual will have an easier time acculturating. Highly extroverted immigrants fare better in terms of their well-being when they immigrate to countries with overall more pronounced levels of extroversion, which is what I just said. People with more independent self-concepts have been found to suffer less distress in acculturating to the United States than people with more interdependent self-concepts, and people who have patterns of emotions that are more similar to those from the host culture report experiencing greater relational well-being. One acculturation strategy is that people need to participate in the larger society of their host culture. Are the people motivated to acquire an identity consistent with that of the host culture? Are these people striving to maintain their own heritage culture and identity as members of that culture? Do people have positive attitudes toward their heritage culture, and are they actively seeking ways to preserve the traditions of their heritage culture? Another strategy of acculturation involves attempts to fully participate in the host culture while at the same time striving to maintain the traditions of one's heritage culture. This is known as integration strategy. People using this strategy have positive views toward both their heritage and their host culture. They are seeking the best of both worlds. Now, this is really kind of an interesting picture because both of these women are wearing kimonos. The makeup is very similar. The indigenous Japanese woman has a lot more white makeup on, of course. But if you look at their kimonos, you can see this is a typical Japanese kimono, and this is one that because we like color, because we like contrast, it's one that they would make. They would make this for somebody in Japan. The Japanese wouldn't buy it. They like duller colors. This is one they would make for somebody in the Western world. And of course, if you were wearing a kimono that looked like this, they would know that you weren't Japanese. The strategy that involves little or no effort to participate in the host culture or to maintain the traditions of the heritage culture is known as the marginalization strategy. People using this strategy have negative views toward both their heritage and their host cultures. This strategy may be something pursued more by people who have grown up in multiple cultures across their childhood. Marginalization culture. Some individuals who have grown up in multiple cultures are sometimes termed as third culture kids, and thus will identify themselves as global citizens. Some researchers do not accept marginalization as a legitimate acculturation strategy, but as a form of neuroticism. The assimilation strategy involves an attempt to fit in and fully participate in the host culture while making little or no effort to maintain the traditions of one's heritage culture. It involves having positive attitudes toward the heritage culture. It reflects a desire to leave behind the ancestral past so as to fit in with the host culture. The separation strategy involves efforts to maintain the traditions of the heritage culture while making little or no effort to participate in the host culture. This strategy is composed of positive attitudes toward the heritage culture and negative attitudes toward the host culture. People pursuing separation strategies do not wish to acculturate to the host culture. The most common strategy people pursue is the integration strategy. The least common strategy is a marginalization strategy. The integration strategy is where you accept both cultures, both your native culture and your host culture. Marginalization is where you reject them both. A person will not strive to fit into the host culture if that culture shows a good deal of prejudice toward the individual's own cultural group. People who have physical features that distinguish them from the majority of those in their host culture will likely experience more prejudice than people who have physical features that allow them to blend in with their host culture. More physically distinct ethnic groups are more likely to maintain negative attitudes toward the host culture and pursue separation or marginalization strategies. And this is one of the reasons why African Americans have had such a difficult time blending in, acculturating to the dominant white culture in the United States. Physically distinct ethnic groups are more likely to actively support collective efforts to benefit their group's social position. People who are of low socioeconomic status or who are members of indigenous cultural groups are more likely to pursue separation or marginalization strategies because the host culture does not typically offer them much that they desire. And I was just thinking, one of the things that we used to talk about is the redheaded stepchild. Why in the world is a redheaded stepchild rejected more than anybody else because of their red hair. That's just something that we used to say in Indiana, the redheaded stepchild. They were talking, that was the individual that stuck out to everybody. That's the individual that was the most rejected. That's what that actually means. The extent to which majority members of the host culture value cultural diversity and tolerance of cultural differences also predicts the amount of prejudice that immigrants experience. When host cultures promote tolerance for diversity and multiculturalism, migrants are more likely to adopt more positive attitudes toward the host culture, which increases the likelihood that they will pursue integration or assimilation strategies. Now, this is really kind of interesting because if you understand the history of the United States, you know that for the longest time, there were select individuals that were rejected. You were rejected if you were Catholic. You were rejected if you had black hair. You were rejected if you had red hair. And it took time for people who were of Irish or Southern European, if they were from the Southern Europe or from Ireland, to be accepted into the general culture in the United States. And the reason is because there were aspects about them that separated them from the German and English and French cultures that dominated in the United States. And if you could tell the difference between one person and another, then they were more likely to be rejected. The acculturation strategy that one adopts might vary across situations. Turkish immigrants in the Netherlands often show an integration strategy in public situations where they act in the mainstream of Dutch ways, yet some will simultaneously show a separation strategy in private, rejecting mainstream Dutch ways when they are in an entirely Turkish immigration setting. And of course, this is these are Dutch fans, Dutch soccer fans. You know that she's Dutch because well, maybe not. She's wearing a Dutch flag. And you can tell which ones of these individuals are Turkish. And the reason you can tell which ones are Turkish is because, for one thing, they're shorter, and for another thing, they have black hair. And everybody else has blonde hair. And if you've ever been to Holland, lots of blondes in Holland. Not very many people with black hair. The four acculturation strategies, assimilation, integration, separation, and marginalization, are hypothesized to yield different outcomes in the acculturation process. The strategy that is hypothesized to result in the lowest degree of acculturative stress is the integration strategy, and much research shows that this strategy yields the most favorable outcomes. Sometimes immigrants will adopt the fast food eating habits of Americans. Among immigrants who have lived in the United States for less than a year, 8% were obese. Among those who had been here for 15 years, 19% were obese. This percentage approaches the obesity rate for American-born residents at 22%. When an immigrant or minority member does not fit the prototype of their host culture, people might question their identity. This is called identity denial. Their identity is called into question because they do not seem to match the prototype of the culture. This is Halle Berry, of course. She is African American, and this is James Franco. James Franco is of Portuguese descent, and that's why he is darker complexion. Halle Berry does not have the distinctive facial features of an African American. That's because her mother is Italian and her father is African American. Another good example is presidential candidate Kamala Harris. Her mother is from India and her father is Jamaican, and he's of African descent. And of course, Donald Trump has questioned whether Kamala Harris is actually black or not, which is kind of interesting. So maybe if Kamala Harris is elected president, maybe this whole identity denial thing will go out the window. We'll see what happens. In 1992, Steele identified a phenomenon that had puzzled psychometricians for decades. What was causing highly qualified African American students to do worse in their studies? Steele's hypothesis is referred to as stereotype threat, the fear that one might do something that will inadvertently confirm a negative stereotype about one's group. After achieving acculturation, an immigrant becomes bicultural. The tendency for bicultural people to evince psychological tendencies between those of their two cultures is called blending. The individual tends to switch between different cultural selves in a process known as frame switching or alternation. Inner city children, especially minorities, quickly learn to discriminate between the norms and unwritten rules that govern their schools and mainstream society and those that govern the streets. Code switching is an essential skill for inner city children to learn if they are to survive and succeed in these two divergent cultural contexts. Frame switching. Anderson in 1999 argues that such children must learn to switch between the code of the decent and the code of the street as they deal with people in their school culture and their street culture. The code of the street permeates many aspects of life, in particular the development of a reputation that one is tough and is not to be messed with. Multiculturals engage in frame switching through the language that they speak. The language that people speak seems to activate an associated cultural network, and this influences how they think. When bilinguals switch between languages, they are not just bringing different vocabularies and grammars to mind, they seem to be bringing different selves to mind as well. Researchers found that people who had lived in more than one culture were more likely to come up with outside-the-box creative solutions to a problem than those who lived in only one culture. Maddox and Galinsky further found that those who had merely visited other cultures as tourists did not show any comparative creative advantage. Visiting other cultures is quite different from living in another culture because the former does not involve any adjustment on the part of the individual. Adjusting to life in a new culture is more likely to provide one with an additional perspective, and this appears to be associated with enhanced creativity. One reason that multicultural experiences foster creative thinking is that living in different cultures fosters a way of thinking called integrative complexity, a willingness and ability to acknowledge and consider different viewpoints on the same issues. And that is it. So I will talk to you next week.